My mom sided with my stepdad and his kids and kicked me out, but they forgot that I own the house. I never thought that my father's careful estate planning would ultimately cause problems for our family. There's a lot to cover here, and I want to make sure I give you the full picture. So let me start at the beginning. I work as a senior software architect for one of Seattle's top tech companies. My dad's always had a job like this. My dad always said that technology was the future. He was really proud when I got into the UW computer science program. He had a thriving construction business, but he wasn't technically minded. He had a real knack for spotting trends, starting with the recession of the late 1980s. He started his construction business from scratch, through some of the toughest times in the industry. He took on projects that other contractors wouldn't touch, using only a pickup truck and the tools he used back then. My mom said they lived in a small apartment and were pretty thrifty, but my dad had this unwavering faith in his vision. He often said that the key is to build relationships, not just buildings. That mindset helped him get through the rough early days. What made Dad's business stand out was the way he treated customers and staff. He was even willing to lose out on some bids to competitors who made exaggerated deadline promises in order to stick to his open pricing policy. He also thought that being upfront about schedules was the best way to build trust. He was right when he said that profits would follow his business, which was known for taking on complex restoration projects that required both technical expertise and historical sensitivity. He was well known in the Seattle area by the mid-1990s thanks to the strong relationships he'd built with his clients and staff. His business made it through the 2008 financial crisis, when a lot of construction companies were struggling, because he had built up such a strong reputation. He kept all his employees on during that period. He actually cut his own pay to zero and took out a second mortgage on his beloved Mustang. I learned more about leadership from watching him handle that issue than I could have from any management course. He always told me that your employees are like your extended family. He always said that if you take care of your employees, they'll take care of your business. At the time, I didn't realize how much his managerial approach influenced my own career. A lot of his ideas were put to use. When I got promoted to team lead at my software business, I set up really thorough documentation procedures for our code, just like he had done for every building site. Thanks to his focus on building good relationships, I was able to lead my development team through some pretty challenging project deadlines. I met Emily, who was 34 at the time, at a hackathon in my junior year. She helped put together the event while she was studying business administration. Even though I was tired, she was really helpful. She liked energy drinks and probably had a pretty messy desk. Somehow, though, she saw my passion for coding and was into that too. She was charming from the get-go. His dad was instantly smitten. He said she's the kind of person who grounds you. After college, her dad helped her get her own marketing firm off the ground. He introduced her to his network of local company owners, showed her how he drafted his contracts, and shared his business objectives with her. He was proud of her achievements. It's not just about what you know. It's about helping others succeed, too. My dad was always happy to share his expertise and lend a hand when needed. Emily and I would always make the drive to my parents' house on Sundays for dinner. We'd all sit on the back deck that my dad had put in and chat about everything and nothing while he got the grill going. Even though he wasn't up to speed on the technical details of my latest project, he still asked some pretty detailed questions. My mom used to say, "There they go again with the computer talk," with a little eye roll. The house was Dad's pride and joy. He bought it with the money he made from his first big construction job in the 1990s. It was a historic restoration project that made his business famous in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. This lovely craftsman-style home has a wraparound porch and a garage that he transformed into a workshop. Everything was organized and in its place. Every tool had its place. He treated the house like a living example of his skill. He kept meticulous records of every renovation. He kept a spreadsheet of every repair, improvement, and paint job. He would say, "A house is like a living thing," as he showed me how to clean the gutters, or you could inspect the foundation. He made sure to keep up with everything, from checking the roof after winter storms to changing air filters. If you don't pay attention to the details, they'll end up causing bigger issues. The workshop was more than just a place to work on tools. He also added some unique storage solutions and a workbench he made especially for teaching me woodworking. He'd completely renovated the garage himself and would say that every piece of wood has its own story. When we were putting up the pegboard wall with shapes for each tool, it wasn't just about organization. It was his way of teaching me that everything has a place and a purpose. It's our job to help tell that story. Our family had a lot of respect for the work that went on in that garage on the weekends. My dad and I would work on his 1967 Mustang for hours on end when he bought it for restoration. He said it would be a project that would strengthen our bond as father and son. That vehicle became a classroom for learning life lessons. His advice, which I still follow today, was simple. Always use the right tool for the job. It's easy to be tempted by shortcuts, but they'll cost you in the long run. If he'd wanted to, Dad could have finished the Mustang project in 1 year, but it took 3. However, he was more interested in the process than the final result. I picked up project management skills and a solid grounding in fundamental mechanics from him. We took pictures of every component we changed, recorded each step, and kept detailed logs of our development. This isn't just about fixing a car. He would say it's about learning how to break down big problems into manageable pieces. I found that lesson really helpful after we got married, Emily and I bought a small house about 20 minutes from my parents' place. My dad encouraged us to get a mortgage, but he helped us out with the down payment. He told me it's important to build your own credit history. He said it's about being able to stand on your own 2 feet. He showed me how to install ceiling fans and fix drywall as he worked on our renovations on the weekends. He was already getting me ready for the responsibilities that come with home ownership. At the time, I was really starting to make a name for myself in my career. I just got promoted to team lead, where I'm now overseeing a team that's creating infrastructure solutions. I loved it, even though the hours were long and the pressure was intense. During my lunch breaks, my dad would often give me a call to see how things were going. He knew what I was up against. He also showed me how to manage a group and oversee the work of others. He always said, "You can't do everything yourself. I can't build a house alone either." When my dad first started feeling exhausted all the time, we were talking about the possibility of starting a family. My mom was really pushing for him to see a doctor, but he kept putting it off. He'd brush off our concerns, saying he was just working too hard. He was working on a huge development deal that would have set his business up for the next 10 years. In hindsight, I wish I'd pushed harder and insisted on those exams sooner. Who knows how things would have turned out at the time? The business was really taking off. Dad was talking about expanding into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest and had recently opened a second office in Portland. He's known for updating the infrastructure of historic buildings without losing their character. He'd be happy to tell you more about it. His clients know he's all about embracing the future while respecting the past. His love of preservation affected everything he did, including his personal and professional life. The Mustang was the topic of our last meaningful conversation. He mentioned that he was thinking about taking it to car shows now that we'd finished restoring it. He suggested we sign up for the Pacific Northwest Classic. His eyes lit up like a kid's. He kept planning for the future until the very end, saying, "Show these youngsters what a real muscle car looks like." It all started like this, until everything changed one morning. I was in an early meeting when my phone buzzed. It was my mom on the phone. We were in the middle of an important project, so I didn't get back to him right away. But I had to go out and take it for some reason. My mom was so upset she couldn't even speak. My dad had a heart attack on a construction site. He'd already left by the time I got to the hospital. The doctors said he'd had a sudden and severe heart attack. He was only 58 years old. The weeks after my dad passed away were a blur of mourning and dealing with the bureaucracy. The funeral was. The place was absolutely packed. Dad was very involved in the business and community and had touched the lives of countless people. Suppliers, contractors, and even competitors came by to show their support. Everyone had a story about how my dad had supported them, given them advice, or simply been there for them when they needed someone to confide in. One of the old craftsmen told me that even though my dad was unable to work during a long illness, he managed to keep him on the payroll. He knew that business was about people first and foremost. Many of the company's employees were devastated. They'd known Dad for decades, and they told me things I'd never heard before. For instance, they told me he paid for their college. One foreman's daughter even helped another through a divorce by lending her textbooks. And he'd stay late to teach apprentices the ins and outs of historical restoration with pictures and handwritten notes from clients and employees. The workplace conference room became a bit of an unofficial monument. We were all impressed by how well Dad had prepared. About a week after the funeral, Mr. Anderson called us into a meeting. He'd brought in this huge accordion file that read, "Family Security Protocol." It was all neatly handwritten by Dad. There were dozens of papers, carefully arranged, and with comprehensive instructions for various areas of his land. I was given a 3-day overview of Dad's estate paperwork. Each color-coded container had notes in his handwriting outlining his decisions. On top of all that, there were also legal documents. In my 35 years of practice, I've never seen an estate plan this thorough. Mr. Anderson said that Dad had even included a 5-year plan. Mr. Anderson gave me a day to go over Dad's estate paperwork. Each color-coded container had personal notes outlining his decisions, along with the legal paperwork. In my 35 years of practice, I've never seen an estate plan this thorough. Mr. Anderson said that Dad had even put together a 5-year business transition plan with backup plans for different scenarios. She also had a year-long business transition plan with contingencies for different scenarios. After that, Mom started going to her church's bereavement support group. That's where she first met Steve. She only mentioned him briefly. Steve recommended this excellent book on healing. Steve said it's normal to feel this way. He was one of the group facilitators and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. I was happy to see that she was getting some support, even if it seemed a little early. Emily made me realize that everyone grieves in their own way. Every Tuesday night, the church. Before long, Mom was often at church functions with Steve more after services. We started with coffee gatherings, then moved on to lunch meetings, and eventually, dinner dates. Our family friends were concerned about how quickly their friendship was developing at a family gathering. My Aunt Jane pulled me aside to say that she was worried that my mom was rushing things to make up for my dad's absence. Mom's changes became more noticeable. She got a new haircut, started dressing differently, and even threw out the garden that Dad had helped her create. I asked her about these changes, and she said she felt it was time for a fresh start. The woman who used to talk about her life with Dad barely mentioned him anymore. It all happened a lot faster than any of us had expected. 6 months after my father's passing, my mother informed us that Steve would be moving in. James is 30 and Lisa is 32. They're his own grown children. They thought it would be a good idea to bring some life back into the house. I tried to be understanding, but it seemed like she was eager to replace everything that my father had built. I'm at a bit of a crossroads right now. How can I make sure that Dad's legacy is preserved? Emily says I should find a balance, but I can't help but think of Dad's letter. I should start preserving those memories first. Sorry for the delay in getting this update to you. Many thanks for all your advice on my previous article. It's been 3 months since I last posted, and things have taken a turn for the worse. Steve's behavior has changed. He used to bug me, but now he acts like he owns the place. My dad left me, and Steve started a big restoration project last month without even asking me first. When I stopped by one weekend, the contractors were tearing up the bookshelves my dad had made for the living room. It was as if Steve owned the building. He was keeping an eye on them and telling them to just throw all this old wood in the dumpster. These were the last project my dad and I worked on together before he became ill. They were more than just shelves. Steve got pretty mad when I asked him about it. I went over to him. He said, "Listen, son, this house needs an update to bring it into the 21st century. Your father's taste is a bit dated. We're actually doing you a favor by increasing the property value." I let him know that any modifications would require my consent from a legal standpoint. It was clear that my mom was on the same page, but he just chuckled and added, "Your mother and I live here too. Steve's aware of these things." She said he's just trying to help the woman who used to love those bookshelves and used to put her collection of antique teacups on them for Christmas. Now, though, she seems to think they were just taking up space. I showed her the house maintenance plans that her dad put together, but she ignored them, saying that they were unnecessary. On top of that, things have gotten worse between Steve's kids and me. James has taken over the workshop and turned it into a CrossFit place while I was away. He held a garage sale and sold most of the tools that my dad had. He repainted rooms and put down vinyl planks instead of the hardwood floors that Dad had refinished. Lisa is making some changes to the space. One evening after dinner, Steve pulled me aside and said, "Since we're paying to live here, we should have our names on the deed. It's only fair." I had to explain to him that they don't have a mortgage because Dad's planning has paid for the house in full. They don't even cover their rent, maintenance expenses, insurance, or property. I'm the one who handles the taxes. Emily suggested that we cut back on the weekly visits now that Emma is here. She's absolutely right. It's not beneficial for anyone in that household to be under a lot of stress. However, taking a back seat has only made Steve more confident. He started sending me bills for improvements that I never approved, and he began making them more regularly. I should be more understanding of my mom's new circumstances. I recently had a chat with my mom's sister. I tried to explain my dad's intentions and my legal obligations, but she just accused me of being stuck in the past. Steve makes her happy, so why not let them make the house their own? I discovered this week that the growth markers that recorded my height from ages 3 to 18 had been removed from the kitchen door frame. Every year on my birthday, my dad would measure me and write the date next to each mark. It's just an old door frame. We can't keep every piece of wood just because your father touched it. When I spoke to my mom about it, she said that I now spend more time sitting in Dad's old chair, which was the only piece of furniture I was able to keep in my garage. Mr. Anderson suggests I start thinking about long-term solutions. If I make the house legally mine, I'll eventually have to make some tough choices about what to do with it. When is it more important to be the one who makes the tough choices than to preserve your father's legacy? And when your whole family is against you, how do you make sure you're on the right side of things morally? I appreciate all of your feedback on my previous post. I've finally reached a breaking point and made a choice that will likely alter everything. I had a chat with my financial advisor about the house situation last week. We could probably make a lot of money renting out the property, enough to cover Emma's future college fund, because nearby property values have gone up by 40% in the last 3 years. During the meeting, I realized that I had been so focused on the practicalities that I hadn't considered the financial implications of letting my mom and Steve live here. When I brought this up with my mom, she got pretty upset. She said, "You can't do this to us. This is where we call home." Steve has put a lot of effort into it, but she wasn't open to hearing that I was just looking at my options. She kept going on about all the changes they'd made, without even asking me if I was okay with them. About an hour later, Steve called. He seemed upset, and his tone was different from his usual confident demeanor. He said, "Listen up. We've built a life here. You're making things more difficult for everyone." He cut me off when I was trying to explain the financial issues and said that they now had sweat equity in the property. I told him that legally, the house belonged to me. My dad left it to me for a reason. "Your father isn't here anymore," he replied. "We need to think about the people who are still living." I ran it by Emily and Mr. Anderson. I wanted to talk it over some more before I made up my mind. When I got to the house the next day, Mom and Steve were working on another remodeling job in the dining room. They'd already started removing the original crown molding, which my dad had made to match the house's antique style. That image just made me more determined. They have 2 weeks to find another place to live. I told them that my mom started crying, saying that I was being heartless and unfair. Steve tried to scare me by listing all the places they had ties to, like his job, church, and neighborhood. When I'm faced with challenging situations, I stay calm and firm, like my dad taught me. I told him I was taught this by my dad, and it's my property. I'm just exercising my legal right as the owner. Steve's cheeks flushed, and he started rattling off all the money they'd spent on upgrades. I told him that the property's historical value had been affected by these unapproved alterations. When Lisa came home and got involved, things got worse. Mom used her pregnancy as a way to get her way right away. "How can you treat your stepsister like this?" I had to let them know that it doesn't affect my property rights and that she's not my stepsister. My mother's whole family has been emotionally manipulating me since they got together to oppose me. Her sister called to say that their parents wanted to make sure my mother was safe. Steve's brother, who's a local real estate agent, left some messages about the challenging rental market. There were also some pretty lengthy messages. Even distant cousins I don't know that well are bringing up Christian ideals and family loyalty. I find it tough dealing with family friends who have known me since I was young. People who grew up with me are now telling me that they're unhappy with my decisions. It feels like every call is another betrayal, no matter how small. Some folks even say that I'm hurting my dad's reputation in the neighborhood. The issue here isn't about being cruel or making a profit. It's about honoring Dad's wishes and preserving what we have. He came up with the idea. It's been tough to see them get rid of all the evidence of him. The house was his legacy. I've covered all their expenses, let them live there rent-free for years, and put up with their unapproved changes. I've reached my limit. They have 2 weeks to come up with new plans. I'm not going to give in to Mom's constant demands for more time. Mr. Anderson says the law is on my side and that I've been more than fair. He's helping me put together the official paperwork for the notice to vacate, making sure everything is accurately documented. I know this makes me look like the bad guy in everyone else's story, but sometimes you've got to stand up for what's right, even when others disagree. I picked up that lesson from my dad. This is the 3rd update. I'd like to thank everyone for their help during this challenging period. It looks like things have reached a dead end, so this will probably be my last update. I gave my mom and Steve a 2-week deadline, but it's already passed. The past 2 weeks have felt like an eternity. They've been trying to make me feel guilty, manipulate me emotionally, and do whatever they can to get me to change my mind. Mom tried everything she could. Every day, she called, alternating between anger and tears. She'd say, "I changed your diapers one day. I gave up everything for you." The next day, she would raise her voice. Steve switched tactics, trying to negotiate instead of using intimidation. He suggested we draw up a formal lease. He even offered to start paying rent. I couldn't really count on them to stick to whatever we agreed on, though. When I got to the house, there were people on the front lawn 3 days before the deadline. My mom had asked friends from church, family, and even some of my dad's former business partners for help. They'd prepared statements about moral commitments and family responsibilities as part of what amounted to an intervention. I listened to people criticize me for 2 hours because I was called out for being a bad son. The topic of honoring your parents was discussed by Mom's pastor and Dad's old secretary, who remembered his generosity with tears in her eyes. My elementary school teacher even showed up to remind me of the morals my father had tried to teach me. The toughest part was when Lisa stood up and talked about how stress could harm her unborn child, while Mom was crying next to her and a few of the church women were giving me a stern look. I picked up some useful tips on managing my emotions, but I was still calm during this unexpected meeting. I listened to everyone talk about my dad. People who hadn't even been to his funeral were sharing their thoughts on what he would have wanted. My dad always said, "When you know you're right, stand your ground." I stood up and told the group that my dad had planned carefully for the future of his family. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved modifications, including the historical elements he ruined and the fine craftsmanship he removed and replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. Then I showed them a letter from my dad explaining why he left everything to me. Some of the older business associates nodded as I read his remarks about trust, accountability, and preserving his legacy. They got it because they knew Dad really well. After that, the group broke up. Some of them looked disapproving, while others apologized gently as they walked away without saying another word. Mom and Steve came back inside. I showed them there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of the deadline. I also hired a security company just in case the house was empty. The rest of their stuff was loaded into Steve's truck. Steve couldn't resist giving me a last jab, but Mom wouldn't look at me as he helped Lisa into his truck. He asked, "Are you happy with how you handled this? I know your father would be proud of how you've treated your mother." I didn't respond. I knew he'd thought this through. What other reason could he have had for being so specific in his will? After they left, I took a quick tour of the house. I hadn't realized the extent of the damage. The new fittings were made from builder-grade materials. Dad had painted over or removed them. We'd spent so many weekends at the workshop over the years, working on his handcrafted woodwork. It was completely different now. I'm not planning to pursue damages, but Mr. Anderson has taken care of documenting everything for any legal considerations. I just want to put this chapter behind me and focus on fixing what can be fixed. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have already been contacted, and they're keen to help with rebuilding the features that were taken out. At the moment, my mom is staying with her sister. Most of my relatives have cut off all contact with me, but some still call to criticize me on social media. Steve's kids are still posting updates about their mom being thrown out of her home, but fewer people are responding to each post. Emily has been a great support to me. She gives me a boost whenever I start to doubt myself, reminding me of Dad's letter and his belief in my ability to make the right choices. I'll eventually tell Emma about her grandfather and the heritage he left behind. I'm trying to save it, but she's still too young to understand what's going on right now. I'm working with a restoration expert. We can maintain the essence of what Dad created, but it won't be flawless. Some things just can't be undone. First, we'll restore the workshop where I learned from my father. I'd also like my daughter to have the chance to study there. Sometimes, playing the bad guy in someone else's story is the price you pay for doing the right thing. I might never be able to, but I'll try to rebuild the relationships I lost. At least I can live with the fact that I preserved what my father trusted me with. As he used to say, integrity is about doing the right thing, even when it's tough, and not about taking the easy way out. I think he'd understand that this will be my last update. I'd like to thank everyone for their support along the way. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. You can also choose to receive notifications so you'll be the first to know about new stories.